Good morning. This is a practice recording for my oral dissertation defense, which is entitled A Framework for Promoting Teacher Self-Efficacy with Mobile Reusable Learning Objects. This presentation has been divided up following the same structure as the actual dissertation document, and I'll be reviewing the main points from each of the chapters of the dissertation. Chapter 1 in the introduction lays out the groundwork for what the study is all about, and it starts with providing some context about the origins of the CSAM framework and the perceived problem under investigation. And the problem that was investigated by this research study emerged from a number of sources which were discussed during the candidacy exam. But in particular, this study was inspired by the negative impact of teachers' perceptions of self-efficacy on the adoption of mobile learning strategies, and the lack of recent self-efficacy research specifically targeting mobile learning. There was also a request from researchers at one of the participating institutions to help them to use the CSAM framework to develop professional development resources for teachers and teacher trainees. CSAM is the Collaborative Situated Active Mobile Learning Design Framework. It presents the 4 critical pedagogical elements that are present in the instructional design of mobile RLOs for collaborative learning, and it's a framework because it's intended to provide instructional design guidance. The question investigated by this study was whether the CSAM framework would have an effect upon teachers' perceptions of self-efficacy with M-learning. The research itself was approached from a nominalist ontological perspective because it was my intention to investigate teachers' perceptions of their own reality, and I felt that this warranted a mixed methodological approach to the research, and the study actually comprises the first 2 phases of an ongoing design-based research project. A professional development course was developed that would expose teachers to the framework. Teachers used the framework to make instructional design decisions about new mobile reusable learning objects, and then they used free online tools to build their mobile RLO prototypes so that they could focus on the instructional design decisions instead of on learning how to use the new authoring suites. So these are the specific research questions from the dissertation document and that were investigated. In particular, does the CSAM learning design framework provide teachers with an increased sense of self-efficacy with use of mobile reusable learning objects to facilitate collaborative learner interactions? And Chapter 2 is the literature review chapter. It provides the background support for the CSAM framework. The qualitative literature review aspect were discussed in detail during my oral candidacy exam. The supporting theories and frameworks were also discussed in detail during the candidacy exam. However, since then I've also added the sections to discuss the ARCS model and the TPAC framework. ARCS and TPAC have been added to the discussion because they're both widely drawn upon in professional development for teachers, particularly in the United States. However, there has been some criticism that TPAC in particular falls short on actually helping teachers to develop their pedagogical knowledge skills. So what I do in this section in Chapter 2 is just show that rather than being a competing framework, CSAM could be used to complement both ARCS and TPAC and to fill in some of those gaps that have been identified. What's really new in Chapter 2 since the candidacy exam is the qualitative meta-analysis section. Qualitative meta-analysis differs from the more common quantitative meta-analysis, which is used to look at empirical results from research studies, multiple research studies, and to compare the trends and show trends and effect sizes across studies. A qualitative meta-analysis, on the other hand, is a systematic review that synthesizes large bodies of literature to look for overarching themes. And I followed the procedures that were described and outlined by AU 2007. This slide shows the results from my qualitative meta-analysis. In this case, I examined 403 articles and chapters from the literature on M-learning over a 5-year period and coded them to reveal specific patterns. And what I found was that 27% of all of the literature focuses on mobile RLOs or uses mobile RLOs as a supporting example for studies that are being described. Of those 107 articles and chapters, 86% were explicitly described as focusing on collaborative learner interactions, and of the articles and chapters that were explicitly collaborative in nature, 96% included all 4 of the CSAM pedagogical elements. Chapter 3 looks at the research design and methodology. This chapter was also discussed in detail during the candidacy exam. What's changed in Chapter 3 since then is some refinement of the descriptions of the methodologies, specifically a more precise delineation of the stages of the research project to reflect the alignment with the DBR model. And this is the major change that was made in Chapter 3. This diagram shows all of the stages of the research study and where they fall in the DBR model. In this case, I've placed the various steps within each of 3 stages of a DBR project. And the next couple of slides are going to zoom in on this diagram a little bit. So this is stage 1 of the DBR project, and it involved the development of the actual intervention for this research study, and which we do hope to continue in the future. Details of this stage are outlined in Chapter 4. Stage 2 of the dissertation document, of the DBR project, included the implementation of the intervention itself, as well as the data collection and analyses. For this study, participants took part in an online professional development course. They completed the quantitative survey at 3 points, twice during the course and once as a 4-month follow-up. The follow-up interviews were conducted over a 2 to 3 week period after the completion of the course. And the implementation of the intervention will be described in detail in Chapter 4. The quantitative data collection and analyses are presented in Chapter 5, and the qualitative data collection and analyses are in Chapter 6. The third stage of the DBR project flows from the results and recommendations of this dissertation research study. And actually, discussions have already begun with one of the partner institutions, as well as some other potential partners, about making revisions to the PD course, future course offerings, and some potential future research studies. The primary research instruments that were used for this study are described in Chapter 3. The first was the Mobile Teacher Sense of Efficacy Scale Survey Instrument. It was developed from the original Ohio State TSES. Some minor contextual changes were made to the wording of the survey questions following the procedures outlined by Benton Borky 2006. And the new instrument allowed participants' perceptions of self-efficacy with mobile learning to be compared to their overall perceptions of self-efficacy as teachers. Cronbach's alpha was calculated to help determine the construct validity for the new instrument, and it was calculated for each of the 3 subdomains of the survey as well as for the total scale. These were then compared to the alpha scores determined for the original TSES as well as those for Benton Borgy's ITSES instrument. And the alpha scores were determined to be fairly consistent, and that tells us that we can have some confidence in the construct validity and the reliability of the new MTSES instrument. The second major research instrument was the use of follow-up interviews. The interviews were recorded electronically and transcribed by a research assistant. They were then returned to the participants for member verification. The transcripts were then coded using the qualitative themes and subthemes that are described in Chapter 3. 2 sample transcripts were coded to determine inter-rater reliability by both myself and a research assistant, and these were then compared along a number of scores, including percent agreement, Scott's pi, Cohen's kappa, and Krippendorf's alpha. The IR was found to be at a very high level for both the primary and simultaneous codings, generally ranging between 0.85 and 0.96. We'll look at the results from the quantitative and qualitative data analyses in detail in Chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 4 really focuses on the first stage of the DBR project, which was the development and initial implementation of the intervention, the professional development course. The course was developed using the Canvas Open Cloud-based learning management system, and it was developed around the CSAM framework and materials and activities that had been previously developed for conference workshops and online professional development seminars. The Quality Matters framework was used to guide the instructional design development process of the course, and I wanted to ensure that the course materials and the interface themselves had minimal negative impact upon participants' learning and the results that were obtained from the instruments. The Quality Matters online self-assessment tool was then used by 3 volunteer instructional developers to conduct a peer review of the course design, strictly from an instructional design perspective. And these results are presented in Chapter 4, and they were used to guide some minor refinements to the pilot course. The course was then piloted with some volunteers from one of the partner institutions who provided additional feedback, leading to some additional further minor refinements. The live course itself was conducted in May 2014. And this slide shows some of the participant figures for the PD course and for the dissertation research study. As you can see, there were 72 registrations for the course, and 41 of those provided informed consent to participate in the study. 36 of those completed the first MTSES survey, and there were 5 interview participants. In Chapter 5 of the dissertation, I present the results of the quantitative data analysis. The primary focus is on the 3 administrations of the MTSES survey, but I do also present a quantitative analysis of responses to the fixed response end of course feedback survey questions. The 3 MTSES surveys were administered using Athabasca University's Lime survey tool to ensure data security and integrity in accordance with the Canadian Tri-Council policy regulations. And an alternative downloadable version of the survey was provided within the course for those participants who did not take part in the research study. Once the surveys had been completed in Lime Survey, all of the results were exported to a password-protected external hard disk in Microsoft Excel format. And Excel was used to conduct all of the statistical analyses because I have a very high level of proficiency with MS Excel, and I wanted to maintain complete control over the formula I used in the analysis so that I knew exactly what was being calculated and how. Statistical analyses were conducted to show trends in the changes in participants' TSES and MTSES scores for the 3 subdomains of student engagement, instructional strategies, and classroom management. And in Chapter 5, these analyses are presented along a number of demographic lines. This slide shows the overall trends amongst all the participants. What you can see is that there is a positive change in participants' perceptions of self-efficacy with mobile learning from the beginning of the course to the end of the course. And the lowest level of change in perceptions of self-efficacy relates to the classroom management skills. The line on the graph represents the net effect on perceptions of self-efficacy as a result of the intervention, accounting for the effects of maturation. What this slide does not show is the results from the 3rd MTSES administration, but while there was a slight downward trend in perceptions of self-efficacy as compared to the end of the course, participants' scores were still higher 4 months later compared to what they were at the beginning of the course. Chapter 5 also includes an analysis of the mean scores on a 9-point scale from the fixed response end of course feedback survey questions. 1 would indicate no influence and a 9 would indicate a great deal of influence. All of the responses range between 5.8 and 6.7 out of 9, indicating that participants did perceive the course and the framework to have been helpful to them, and here's some examples of some of the highest scores that were obtained for particular questions on that survey. In Chapter 6, we turn to the qualitative data analysis, and the qualitative data came from 2 primary sources. One was open response feedback questions on the end of course surveys. The other was the follow-up interview sessions with 5 course participants. The qualitative analyses process involved exporting the open response survey question data from Lime Survey to Excel, as well as transcribing the interview recordings, which were also imported into Excel after member verification. Using Excel, the survey responses and interview transcripts were broken down into thematic units for analysis and coding. Each thematic unit was assigned a primary code as well as a simultaneous code. For instance, a statement that was coded as relating to the strengths of the CSAM framework was also given a simultaneous code to further specify whether the participant was discussing the clarity of the framework, its comprehensiveness, or the ability of the framework to provide them with instructional design guidance. And these are the overall trends from the qualitative coding of the survey responses and interview transcripts. There were a total of 278 thematic units coded. And some of the themes of note from the simultaneous coding were that participants found instructional design guidance to be a major strength of the CSAM framework. Participants indicated that they were now interested in using mobile RLOs if an appropriate opportunity arises, and that they found a lack of institutional interest is still a significant barrier to using mobile RLOs. Chapters 7 and 8 of the dissertation document present the discussion, conclusions, and recommendations from the research study. And here are some of the main findings from the research. Participants enjoyed the professional development course. They expressed a perception that the CSAM framework had helped to increase their understanding of and confidence with designing and using mobile RLOs. The MTSES survey results demonstrate increases in participants' perceptions of self-efficacy. and participants expressed increased interest in integrating mobile RLOs into their actual teaching practice. So these findings provide an affirmative answer to the initial research question. That is, the CSAM Learning Design Framework does provide teachers with an increased sense of self-efficacy in the use of mobile reusable learning objects to facilitate or enhance collaborative learner interactions. However, the voluntary nature of self-enrollment for the PD course and the demographics of the participants do represent limitations to the generalizability of the findings. Chapter 8 includes some recommendations for future iterations of the CSAM PD course as well as for future research. Discussions are already underway for future use of the PD course materials, and some of the recommendations stemming from the study are being incorporated to improve the overall course design. Recommendations for future phases of the design-based research project include developing and seeking feedback on the recommended course refinements, verifying the findings from this study with wider subsets of the teacher population, and looking more closely at the reasons why participants perceived changes in their perceptions of self-efficacy. So what exactly is the significance of this research study? Well, it demonstrated the utility of the CSAM framework. It explored the potential for CSAM-focused PD to increase teachers' perceptions of self-efficacy. It developed an instrument that can be used to gauge teachers' perceptions of self-efficacy with respect to designing and using mobile RLOs. It explored issues of instructional design competency with the use of educational technologies that are becoming increasingly pervasive in all sectors of education. And it contributed to the body of knowledge about how to better prepare teachers to integrate mobile learning strategies and resources into instructional design at any level of the education system. So here are some acknowledgements as to who has helped me to make this research study possible, and now I will open the floor to any questions.